If you saw the video summary of my June 2021 trip, you may remember this guy. I explained how I had witnessed to him and his friend. His friend, if you remember, was the keeper of the keys to the town school. He was always gracious to give us the keys for our meetings. His name was Arnulfo. He had actually never come to a meeting until after that conversation that day. He always presented himself with a certain sophistication and charisma. After all, it was his job to represent his town to county and state governments. On this trip, we ran into him in Ciénega Prieta, an isolated group of just 3 scattered houses. He was on horseback with 4 other cowboys. 3 of them were very drunk, including him. I didn't recognize him at first because he looked so bad as he teetered precariously atop his horse. He was so embarrassed for me to see him that way. They say that he had fallen off his horse on his face. That was very possibly so, but just as likely he had gotten into some nonsensical fight while he was drunk. I helped him out of the saddle as he cried like a baby that this was not who he wanted to be. He sobbed as he asked me to pray that God would change him. He went on and on that he didn't want to be like that. I helped him into the old 2-room log cabin with a dirt floor and no windows where an old grandmother lived by herself. I prayed with him and laid him down to sleep it off. We will have much to talk about the next time I see him. It is my hope that he will be very ready to make a serious commitment to the Lord. His sister and niece already have. This is my older brother Tom pictured with that grandmother. One of her sons lives in one of the other houses of the 3. A family of 4 lives in the 3rd house. All are believers and thoroughly appreciate our visit to their isolated and remote homes. We had already visited the villages of Pachera, Temechic, Las Ranas, El Mesteño, and Piloncillo. So it was up and over the 8,000-foot mountains and down into the deep canyons for the towns of Batopilas, San Ignacio, and La Palma. Batopilas is the town where a woman pastor had destroyed the church by her heavy-handed and unloving ways. The church had been reduced from 50 to only several. During our visit there last year, before we understood what had happened, she asked me to speak. Only 1 person showed up. That was January of 2021. When I returned in June, I learned that there were believers who had been driven off and hurt by her. I went around to visit them and encourage them to meet together on their own. They immediately began to do so. This is a video of the group last month. I have watched it grow from just 4 people to this so far. I am in constant contact with them as they call me and send videos of the group each week. It was my desire to return to La Palma, the remote village I had visited in June, where most everyone is a believer because of the efforts of a missionary, a Mexican missionary actually, who had gone there years before. That Christian brother was ultimately murdered by a bullet to the head. La Palma is a remote village that rarely receives encouragement from outside due to the fact that it is still another 4 hours of difficult dirt roads beyond Batopilas. 2 hours from Batopilas, however, is the town of San Ignacio, the halfway mark to La Palma. My brother Tom, who accompanied me this trip, and I took off in his van. He had added a special differential as well as a lift kit to make the vehicle more prepared for these roads. In my previous trip 5 months earlier, I had gone alone in my little Nissan Frontier pickup truck. Our plan was to spend an evening in San Ignacio, where we would spontaneously put together a meeting in the town plaza. As we approached the town, the differential in my brother's van began to slip. The van would not climb much of an incline. I told him it would never make it to La Palma since there were many, many steep hills to climb to get there. We decided to have our meeting in San Ignacio and then hopefully make it back to Batopilas the next day. We went around town inviting people. That evening, we counted 30 married couples, plus single adults and many children. With a video projector, I showed them a short video of people narrowly missing death or serious injury. This is a few seconds from it. After the video, I pointed out that most of those people were really lucky, but that some of them, well, there was something else going on. I told them that I would quote them a verse from the Bible that would probably be unimpressive, but that I would then explain the verse phrase by phrase, and they would most likely be quite impressed. I quoted Romans 8:29 to them. That says, "For whom God foreknew, he did also predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the preeminent one among many brothers and sisters." I then repeated the first phrase, which says, "For whom God foreknew." I asked them if they thought God knew who, in my audience that day, was going to one day figure out what I was trying to show them and would make a decision to follow Jesus. They were all sure that God knew who those people were. I then asked them if God knew who the ones were in the audience at that moment that would never figure this out and would never humble themselves before God, and would sadly have to pay the eternal consequences for all their sin themselves. They agreed that God must know those people as well. We went on to the next phrase. "For whom God foreknew, he did also predestinate." I explained that since God knew the ones that would one day submit themselves to God's will for their life, he lovingly promised to protect those people from the devil, who most certainly would want to take their life before they ever reached that point of submission to God. We went on to the next phrase. "For whom God foreknew, he did also predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son." I explained that God wants to help us change and be a little bit more like Jesus and a little less like the devil. Then I told them the most important and amazing part of that verse was the last part. "For whom God foreknew, he did also predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the preeminent one among many brothers and sisters." I asked them if they could possibly fathom the concept that the Creator of heaven and earth and all the stars we could clearly see that evening wanted to be their big brother. I asked them if they did not agree that that verse was remarkable after all. I then made them aware that the entire Bible comes alive that way for people who have decided to follow Jesus and have the Holy Spirit living in them. Then I played them a short second video that I have speeded up here. It shows a plane landing in the mountains of New Zealand, with cloud cover blinding the pilot from seeing the runway. Music accompanies the full-length version, which is dramatic and gripping. I then explained how the pilot has a panel full of instruments which tell him everything about the position and course of the plane. I then shared with them an experience I had had when I first moved to Houston. It was a news item about a doctor who was killed along with his wife and 2 children. He was a pilot and took his family up for a ride in the sky. A bad weather front quickly and unexpectedly moved in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The last screamed words that the airport tower heard from the doctor pilot was, "None of my instruments are working. None of my instruments are working," as he flew vertically straight down into the ground from the low cloud level. Of course, his instruments were working just fine. He just didn't trust them. You, of course, see the obvious correlation to the Bible and the gospel, which I passionately explained to them. I then asked who wanted to make a decision to follow Jesus. Who was prepared to do life God's way? In the darkness of the circumference of the plaza, I could see hands go up. I then asked them to do the difficult thing of coming forward so that we could pray together. In these little villages, that is a hard thing to ask. These people all know each other and each other's business. Most of them are related in some way. Then there is the matter of their ancestral religion, which they can be seen as being a traitor to. Nonetheless, they came. Then others who wished they had raised their hand came. Then more, whose confidence was bolstered by the response of the others, came. Then all the rest came. No one was left sitting on the walls and benches of the town plaza. We were about to pray a prayer, which after I was going to tell them that their sins were eternally forgiven. I couldn't tell that to all these people who had come from a religious tradition that teaches them that performance of certain rituals can affirm their right standing with God. For example, if they've been confirmed and get the last rites before they die, they'll probably make it to heaven. So I had to say this. We are going to pray a prayer right now, and some of you are still going to pay the eternal consequences for your sin yourself because you came up here because everyone else did. God sees your insincerity. But others of you, wow, you are about to be freed from the eternal consequences of every bad thing you ever did and every bad thing you ever will do because you have a sincere heart right now. When we prayed, you could have heard the group 2 blocks away. Nobody was shy about it. We then distributed Bibles to every family that did not have one. The guy in the foreground has one in his left hand. We also gave every person a Daily Bread booklet, which has a reading for each day for 90 days. I am in the process of finding a pastor to go to that town since there is now an instant church body there. Someone graciously fed us that evening and gave us a place to sleep that night. The next morning, we left early to return to Batopilas, where I was supposed to speak. We could hear and feel the differential slipping with each incline. Finally, it would go no further as we reached the steeper part of the road back over the mountain. It was about 9 a.m. in the morning, but we were still 15 kilometers of dirt roads from our destination, and 6 of them were straight up the mountain. There was nothing else to do but walk. I took a bottle of water and left my brother at the van. My hopeful plan was to bring back a 4x4 that could pull the van up over the mountain. I soon ran into this guy, or gal, as the nursing calf betrays. I'd been warned numerous times to be cautious with animals like this that are semi-wild, so I approached slowly. When I was finally about 15 yards away, she lowered her head menacingly. I stopped. I waited a moment and then began to advance again. She again lowered her head, showing me her horns. I just waited patiently several minutes, and she finally wandered off after her calf had safely joined the other cows up the mountainside. It was November, but it was hot in this canyon in the southern part of the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. It was only 6 kilometers to the top of the mountain, but it took me 3 hours because it was such a steep walk. I actually think I look pretty good here considering how I felt at that moment. However, I still had 9 kilometers to go down the other side of the mountain. I hadn't gone very far when I heard a rustle in the bushes ahead of me. 50 yards away, a cat emerged, crossing the road. He stopped in the middle of the road when he noticed me. Like an arrow, he bounded right at me. I quickly stooped down to pick up a rock, but all that I found was a 2-foot branch of a tree. I picked it up just as the cat sprung at me, jaws wide open. I braced myself and firmly gripped the stick in both hands as I held it out towards his head. It caught him in the roof of his mouth as I stepped to the side, and he fell to the ground just past me. I turned to face him, expecting him to attack again. At that moment, a cowboy on a horse appeared with 5 dogs. Those dogs chased the cat up a tree where the cowboy shot it. Okay, I lied about the part where the cat attacked me. The rest is true, though. These mountain lions kill cattle all the time. This is Nacho from Piloncillo. When we arrived there earlier in the trip, he had just killed this puma with his 5 dogs. Well, back to the problem of the broken down van. It only took me about 2 hours to walk the 9 kilometers down the Batopilas. By the time I got there, though, I was dragging my feet and walking a little like a drunk, I think. The local mechanic had a strong 4x4, I was told. I had to track him down drinking with his buddies. I was skeptical that any truck could pull that van up over the mountain. The mechanic was confident he could. He demanded $25 up front. That was for more beer for him and his friends who all came along. Sure enough, he attached a chain to the van and was able to pull it to the top of the mountain, from where we were able to coast all the way to his little shop in town. The mechanic charged us another $75 that we were happy to pay. Miraculously, and I'm not resorting to hyperbole here, the mechanic found someone in town who had an old axle laying out in his corral that was at least from a Chevy vehicle of some sort, like the van. Miraculously, the differential from that old rusty axle was undamaged inside and perfectly fit my brother's van. I think he wanted $50 for the fix. I was supposed to speak that Sunday morning to the new group of believers in Batopilas, but didn't get back into town with the van until late in the afternoon. We left clothes and shoes, though, that were distributed in the subsequent weeks. I also left 2 of these video projectors, one for the newly meeting Christians in Batopilas and one for the poor remote church in La Palma. Before each trip, I always think that the blessings and adventures of my previous trip could never be matched, but somehow God manages to make each trip exciting and fruitful in terms of souls saved and believers encouraged. And I am constantly amazed how the Lord always prepares the way, whether it's someone to feed me, or where to sleep, or how to drag a van over a remote mountain, and to stay safe the whole time.